talking about the Battle of Ball's Bluff. A small battle, but not a completely insignificant one, fought on October 21st, 1861. I've been studying this battle for close to 40 years because three of my ancestors fought at this battle. And so the book I wrote, there it is, Swim, Surrender, or Die. It is principally a book I wrote to tell the story of my ancestors, although I bring a lot of other Northern troops into it. It is focused on the Union troops who fought there. It's a short book of about 150 pages, and it could have easily been 100 pages. The company that published it kind of spread it out a little bit. My story begins on Monday, May 6th, 1861, 3 days after President Abraham Lincoln's second call for Union troops. The first was after Fort Sumter, when he called for 75,000 troops to serve for 3 months. The second, on May 3rd, was for 300,000 to serve for 3 years. 6 regiments were requested, all volunteers, from Massachusetts. So on Monday, May 6, 1861, in Leominster, Massachusetts, that evening a recruiting rally was held for the 15th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. There was a bonfire, a big crowd, and a brief speech by a 96-year-old veteran of the American Revolution. That evening, Luther Sawyer Hapgood, who was my great-great-grandfather, and his brother Joseph, this is a picture of Joseph, they attended the rally. Luther was 25, Joseph was 21. I wish I had a picture of Luther when he was young, but I don't. They were a 7th-generation Massachusetts family descended from solid Puritan stock. And they worked with their father on the family dairy farm nearby. The brothers returned home that evening as members of Company A, 15th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, with orders to report to Worcester on June 28th. The other ancestor I want to speak of is John William Willie Grout. This is him. Grout was the son of a prosperous Worcester family and had always dreamed of being a soldier. When he was 5 years old, a teacher asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. "I want to be Zachary Taylor," he replied, referring to the Mexican War general and hero. After high school, he had attended the Highland Military School in Worcester, and so his skills were in demand when the war broke out, but his parents did not want their only son to join the army. Willie pleaded his case with them for weeks before they finally relented. It was said of Willie that, quote, his joy knew no bounds. In early June, he was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in Company D, 15th Massachusetts Volunteers. While in training camp, their regimental commander, Charles Devins, took notice of the young officer, calling him, quote, a model of behavior, unquote. Willie and his regiment were stationed at Poolesville, Maryland. Poolesville is about 35 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., and it's right on the banks of the Potomac River, where the Potomac forms an arc, right there at Poolesville. The 15th was one of several regiments assigned to the Poolesville area. They were part of a 10,000-man division designated as a Corps of Observation, which guarded the Potomac opposite Leesburg, Virginia. This division was commanded by Brigadier General Charles Pomeroy Stone. It's a picture of Stone. Stone was 36 and handsome, with shoulder-length brown hair and a distinguished Van Dyke. He had graduated from West Point in 1845, 7th in a class of 41. He served with distinction in the Mexican War, earning 2 brevets. Stone had been placed in charge of security at Lincoln's inaugural on March 4th, 1861. Rumors were rife that someone would try to kill Lincoln that day, but Stone had seen to it that things went off without a hitch. I flash forward now to Sunday, October 20th, 1861, to the White House lawn in Washington, D.C., and in the morning, President Lincoln leaned against a tree, and Edward Baker lay upon the grass as the two men talked together. Here's a photo of Edward Baker. The two men were old friends, having shared a law office in the same building back in Springfield, Illinois. Both had served as Whig congressmen from the state. During the Mexican War, Baker had raised and commanded the 4th Illinois Infantry and had won great renown at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. Baker had gone to California after the war and later to Oregon, where he'd been elected senator. The Lincolns so admired Edwin Baker that they named their second son Edward Baker Lincoln. Lincoln once called Baker my dearest personal friend. Though a colonel in command of the 71st Pennsylvania, Baker continued to serve as a senator. Had he achieved a higher rank than colonel, he would have had to give up his position as senator, but he didn't, so he remained in the Senate. The 71st Pennsylvania was part of George Stone's Corps of Observation near Poolesville, Maryland. But Baker had had a premonition, and so he'd come to Washington to settle his affairs. When it came time for him to leave, Baker stood and shook the president's hand. He took young Willie Lincoln in his arms and kissed him goodbye. Mary Lincoln handed Baker a bouquet of flowers. "Those flowers and my memory will wither together," he said, and he departed. Later that same morning, Sunday, October 20th, 1860, General Stone received the following dispatch from the Assistant Adjutant General to the Commander of the Army, General of the Army of the Potomac, General George B. McClellan. I'm sure you're all familiar with this face. The dispatch read as follows: General McClellan desires me to inform you that Brigadier General George A. McCall occupied Drainesville yesterday and is still there. We'll send out heavy reconnaissances today in all directions from that point. The general desires that you keep a good lookout upon Leesburg to see if this movement has the effect to drive them away. Perhaps a slight demonstration on your part could have the effect to move them. What did slight demonstration mean? General Stone had to figure it out. McClellan wasn't specific. Should Stone send troops across the river to reconnoiter? Should he merely move his men about so they would appear to be up to something? Or should he fire a few shells into the woods on the other side of the river and see what reaction, if any, he received? McClellan was not clear. He left everything to Stone's discretion, and in doing so, he completely absolved himself of any responsibility. Poolesville, Maryland, and Leesburg, Virginia, were about 8 miles apart. Between them lay the Potomac River. In the middle of the river was Harrison's Island, which was about 150 yards wide and contained 400 acres of mostly farmland. Above the northern end of the island was Conrad's Ferry. I've drawn this very childlike map. I apologize. I'm not an artist. And south of the island lay Edwards Ferry. Stone went to Edwards Ferry, where Confederates had been seen on the opposite bank of the Potomac. He told the officer in command there, quote, to display his forces in view of the enemy, unquote, and to put flatboats in the river and fire shells into the woods on the Virginia side, quote, to produce an impression that a crossing was to be made, unquote. Stone also ordered Colonel Charles Devins of the 15th Massachusetts to detach Captain Chase Philbrick of Company H with 20 men, quote, to cross from the island and explore by a path through the woods, little used, in the direction of Leesburg to see if he could find anything concerning the enemy's position in that direction, but to retire and report on discovering any of the enemy, unquote. So Stone's response to McClellan's orders seemed intelligent and logical. It was almost dusk by the time Captain Chase Philbrick and his squad of 20 reached the Virginia shore. They found the overgrown path that twisted up the side of a steep bluff covered with trees, rocks, and brush. Known to locals as Ball's Bluff, it was about 100 feet high and 250 yards wide. If you go to the battlefield today, you can walk up the same path the soldiers used up and down the side of that bluff. The path through the clearing and into the woods beyond is not as clear. It was almost dark when Philbrick and his men emerged into the second clearing. The path led on, but suddenly Philbrick pulled up. Across the field, quote, in the edge of a wood, unquote, Philbrick saw what appeared to be, quote, an encampment of about 30 tents. He crawled as close to the camp as they could get, quote, to within about 25 yards without being challenged, unquote. Philbrick fell back to report to General Stone what they had discovered. That night, at Edwards Ferry, at 10 p.m., Lieutenant Churchhow arrived with a report from Colonel Devins informing General Stone of Captain Chase Philbrick's findings. As a result of this report, General Stone ordered Colonel Devins to cross the river with part of his regiment, quote, to the Virginia shore, march silently under cover of night to the position of the camp referred to attack and destroy it at daybreak, pursue the enemy lodged there as far as would be prudent with his small force, and return rapidly to the island, unquote. 2 companies of the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, Companies I and E, were ordered to cover the return of Devon's men by placing themselves on the path at the top of the bluff. Their colonel, William Lee, went with them. The rest of the 20th was to cross to Harrison's Island. The 20th, by the way, the 20th Massachusetts was known as the Harvard Regiment because many of its members had graduated from that school. The 15th was known as the Webster Regiment because so many men were from that area. Or if you go to Massachusetts, it's Worcester, the Webster Regiment. These regiments were called sister regiments, and they were often near or next to each other. In fact, at Gettysburg, they stood right next to each other along Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd. Monday, 21 October 1861, on Harrison's Island at 1:30 a.m., the drums beat the long roll. This was a signal that the men of Company A, 15th Massachusetts, should dress, gather their weapons and accoutrements, and form up. To the river, First Sergeant Hans Jorgensen told them. Take your blankets, overcoats, and 1 day's rations. Shortly afterward, Privates Luther and Joseph Hapgood shouldered their muskets, took a seat in one of the skiffs, and set out across the dark water for their first journey into rebeldom. At dawn, the sun rose to reveal, quote, a lovely, rare October day, unquote. Chase Philbrick and Colonel Charles Devins and 5 companies of the 15th Massachusetts moved toward the site where the rebel camp had been seen, but no camp was found. The line of trees at the far end of the clearing, said Devins, quote, presented in an uncertain light somewhat the appearance of a line of tents, unquote. But no such camp had ever existed. Philbrick was young and had seen no action. It was an honest mistake. And I should point out that all of the Union troops that are engaged at the Battle of Ball's Bluff have never seen action before. They're all green. Whereas all the Confederate troops who are engaged had seen action at First Bull Run. So they had at least some experience. In the early morning, Colonel Devins sent Lieutenant Church Howe to report to General Stone at Edwards Ferry that there was no camp, and Devins had decided to remain where he was since there was no enemy around. Stone ordered 5 more companies from the 15th and 20th to cross to Virginia. Just then, Colonel Edward Baker arrived at Stone's headquarters. Baker told Stone his men were under arms and ready to march. Stone suddenly had an idea. I decided to send Baker to Harrison's Island to assume command. Stone gave Baker the use of 3 pieces of artillery and Colonel Milton Cogswell's 42nd New York, also known as the Tammany Regiment. Stone told Baker he wanted no advance unless the enemy were inferior in numbers. I do not like to see guns exposed to being lost, Stone told Baker. If you use guns, see to it that they are well supported by infantry. Stone stayed at Edwards Ferry. So far, the only Confederate troops that had been seen were at Edwards Ferry. At 8 a.m., Devins deployed Captain Chase Philbrick and Company H as skirmishers in a cornfield beyond the woods. The rest of the 15th had breakfast. No fires were allowed, so most of them munched on hardtack or gnawed at it. If you've ever had hardtack, you know that you can't really bite into it. You have to kind of gnaw at it. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Company H had been fired on by a company of riflemen. This was Company K of the 7th Mississippi. Devins sent Company C to the right, Company A to the left, and Company G to support Philbrick and Company H. The bullets made a rustling sound as they flew among the brown stalks of corn. The Hapgood brothers found themselves in their first fight. The enemy was quickly reinforced. The entire 17th Mississippi Regiment, along with 2 companies from the 8th Mississippi, another from the 13th Mississippi, and 3 troops or companies of cavalry. The fighting intensified. At the top of the bluff, Colonel Lee of the 20th Massachusetts heard, quote, a splendid volley, and minutes later, quote, wounded men began to appear coming along the path as it opened from the woods into the open space where I was posted on the bluff. 6 wounded men were sent back to Harrison's Island to a hospital that had been set up in a barn by Dr. Edward Revere, the assistant surgeon of the 20th Massachusetts. He and his brother, Major Paul Revere, also a member of the 20th, were grandsons of the famous rider. Devins' men were soon flanked by the cavalry, and he ordered a retreat back to the support of the 20th at the top of the bluff. They came, said Lee, in excellent order. Private Roland E. Bowen was a member of Company B of the 15th. He was 24 and a mill worker before the war. He was crossing Harrison's Island when, quote, I hear a sharp volley of musketry followed by a running fire for 10 or 15 minutes that is loud and fire at will. Bowen told a comrade, I am afraid they will cut our men to pieces. His friend replied, no, we will give 'em hell. Bowen and his company were soon loading onto boats to cross to Virginia. As we near the shore, a dead silence prevailed, noted Bowen. Devins' men, of course, had fallen back to the bluff, and the shooting had ceased. As they reached the shore, one man called out, Virginia! A second man said, we are here, ain't we? And Bowen said, and they can't drive us off either. They began to climb the path that led up the bluff. Like Bowen, 2nd Lieutenant Willie Grout of Company D, 15th Massachusetts, was part of the 15th reinforcements that arrived. They brought Devins' force to 625 men, more than double his initial number. He decided to return to his initial position in the woods. There was some firing, but it was intermittent, and Devins resolved to hold this place. Devins did not want young Willie Grout to be placed in harm's way. Willie was only 18. So he sent him back down the bluff and placed him in charge of getting the wounded back to Harrison's Island. At 10 a.m., Colonel Baker arrived on the Maryland side of Harrison's Island, opposite Harrison's Island. He found his regiment, the 71st Pennsylvania, waiting there for him. Baker did not know what was going on across the river, but he surely heard the firing of muskets a mile away. He went to his second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Webster. "You must hurry all you can," Baker told Webster. "Get everything that can float. Cross every man you can into Virginia." Baker never went to the field. He made no attempt to communicate with Colonels Devins or Lee. It seems like he wanted a fight, and he was going to see that he got one. 5 companies of the 20th Massachusetts at Harrison's Island were ordered to cross immediately. Baker's regiment would follow them, and the 42nd New York would trail Baker's regiment. Realizing that there were only 2 boats capable of carrying 60 men at a time, Baker went in search of more boats, a job that he should have delegated to a junior officer. At 11:30 a.m., companies of the 15th followed the path to the second clearing. "Here we overtook the other 5 companies that had gone before us," wrote Roland Bowen. "Finally, the 15th were all together." Company A, with Luther and Joseph Hapgood, were deployed as skirmishers. They could see the tops of buildings in Leesburg. Their first sergeant, Hans Jorgensen, was soon helped to the rear with a bullet through his arm. Soon Bowen's Company B was sent in to relieve Company A. At 11:50 a.m., General Stone learned that a large Confederate force opposed Baker. He sent him this report: "Colonel, I am informed that the force of the enemy is about 4,000 all told." Baker told the courier, "I shall not retire." Stone later wrote, "I had no doubt that Baker felt perfectly able to meet that force." At 1 p.m., Major Paul Revere and the rest of the 20th Massachusetts arrived at the top of the bluff. Revere informed Colonel Lee that Colonel Baker was now in command. At this same time, a frightened officer ran down the bluff to the beach. He saw Colonel Baker and the 71st Pennsylvania just beginning to cross from Harrison's Island. "Hurry over," the officer called out. "We can see 3 regiments of infantry coming down from Leesburg." "Then there will be more for us to whip," Baker shouted back. At 2 p.m., Baker arrived at the top of the bluff. Roland Bowen and Company B of the 15th Massachusetts were still on skirmisher duty. Bowen noted that nothing much was happening, but that quickly changed. "But hold," he wrote, "shots from the left. I look. Great God, they are upon us. They have flanked us." They fell back to the main body of the regiment. "Now they turned their whole fire upon us, and we had it. Give and take, fire and smoke, blood and thunder. Our men came bravely up to the scratch." Bowen hid behind a narrow oak tree. The bullets flew all around. He admitted his knees knocked. A bullet went through his coat but missed him. A second bullet broke the strap of his cartridge box. Now the bullets flew thick as hailstones. "I did not expect to live 1 minute more," Bowen wrote. "I thought the next one would go right through me." Colonel Devins then ordered the 15th to retreat back to the bluff. At 3 p.m., Isaac Webster arrived on the bluff with the rest of the 71st Pennsylvania. He said a, quote, "slight spitting fire came from the woods in front." Baker came to him and showed Webster the message from Stone, which said there were 4,000 Confederates opposing them. "We are greatly outnumbered in front," Webster stated. "Yes," Baker replied, "that is a bad condition of things." The firing intensified. Baker said, "I throw the entire responsibility of the left wing upon you." Webster had never been in combat. "What should I do?" he asked. Do as you like, Baker replied, and he moved away. Baker had 1,700 men in an open field with their backs against a high steep cliff beyond which lay the Potomac. Only 3 boats capable of carrying 30 men each were at his disposal. As you can see by this map, which is accurate even though it's childlike, the artillery are out in front of the infantry. They are not protected by the infantry. And the 15th Massachusetts is over there on the right flank. For what reason, I don't know. Anyway, he put his artillery in front of the infantry, ignoring Stone's instructions to see that they were supported by infantry. Baker placed his reserve, 2 companies of the 15th, behind the 20th. They would be exposed from fire in any assault, but could not return fire without hitting the 20th. Of their position, 2nd Lieutenant Henry Abbott of the 20th wrote, "It was in fact one of the most complete slaughter pens ever devised." At 4 p.m., the firing grew heavier. The Confederates appeared out of the woods in front. 1st Lieutenant Oliver Wendell Holmes of the 20th, it's a picture of Holmes, Company A, 20th Massachusetts, was 19 and had just graduated from Harvard. Standing in front of his company and urging them on, Holmes was struck in the stomach by a bullet. He fell and crawled to the rear a few paces when Colonel Lee walked by. "That's right, Mr. Holmes. Go to the rear," Lee said. This comment embarrassed Holmes. He used his saber to pull himself to his feet and return to the front of his company. "It seemed like every square inch of air within 6 feet of the ground was traversed by bullets as they whistled by us," wrote Lieutenant Abbott. "All the men and horses of the 3 cannon were killed." Private Roland E. Bowen of the 15th Mass wrote, "In the morning I was a frightened and trembling body, but now I didn't care a damn. The more I could kill, the louder I would shout. Was not afraid of anything." He saw dead bodies on the field. Sighs and groans, dead men were nothing now. At about this time, Private Joseph Hapgood of Company A, 15th Massachusetts, received a wound in his leg. I'll go back and show you his picture again. He managed to crawl down the bluff and was placed in a boat and sent back to the hospital on Harrison's Island. Captain William Barlett of Company I, 20th Massachusetts, wrote, "The balls flew like hail. The whizzing of the balls was a new sensation. I had read so much about being under fire that I was curious to experience it. I had a fair chance." By this time, Colonel Charles Devins would write, this is Devins, "It became painfully evident by the volume and rapidity of the enemy's fire that he was in much larger force than we." Colonel Milton Cogswell arrived with members of the 42nd New York. Colonel Baker went to him. "One blast upon your bugle horn is worth 1,000 men, Baker said, quoting Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. Baker asked Cogswell, an 1849 graduate of West Point, to review the positions of the troops. After doing so, Cogswell wrote, "I told him frankly that I deemed them very defective." At 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Holmes, still in front of his men, was hit in the chest. "I felt as if a horse had kicked me," Holmes remembered. First Sergeant Henry J. Smith, quote, "lugged me to the rear a little way and opened my shirt and Smith carried Holmes down to the beach where he would wait to be put in one of the boats to be taken back to Harrison's Island. Baker was near the 20th Massachusetts. He, quote, "seemed indifferent to the bullets," noted Captain Bartlett. Bartlett told him to take cover, but Baker refused. He said it was of no use. It was all over with us. Baker moved off to the left. The fire continued with terrific fury, wrote Major Paul Revere of the 20th. Holmes lay on the beach, waiting to be placed in a boat. Next to him was the body of Sergeant John Merchant, shot through the head and covered with blood, Holmes stated. He began to think, shot through the lungs? Let's see, and I spit. Yes, already the blood was in my mouth. He remembered reading if you were shot through the lungs, you would die a painful death. Finally, he was placed in a boat and taken to the hospital on Harrison's Island. Go back to Holmes. At 5 p.m., Baker was standing in front of his regiment in a Napoleonic pose, his sword in one hand, his other tucked inside his frock coat. A mounted Confederate soldier appeared from the woods on the left. Baker pointed to him, and several Union soldiers turned and fired. The horse was left riderless. "See, he falls," said Baker. A rebel came out of the woods and fired at Baker, hitting him in the head. Baker went down, but he struggled back to his feet only to be hit several times and fall. It's a painting depicting the shooting of Baker. Baker was, quote, struck by 8 bullets, as I afterwards learned, wrote Captain Casper Crowenshield, who was next to Baker. One of them entered Baker's heart. He fell without a groan. Crowenshield's coat was splattered with Baker's brains. He admitted that he, quote, felt quite faint and sick at my stomach. Edward Baker is the only sitting senator in U.S. history to be killed in battle. Baker's body was carried to safety. Here's a drawing of that, and you can see the bluff off to the right and the head of Baker kind of upside down as they carry him away, and some men try and fight as well. Today, if you go to the battlefield, there is a marker there where Baker fell. If the bullets had rained before, wrote Captain Bartlett, they came in sheets now. Discussion among the 3 remaining colonels went on for a little time about who was now in charge. Finally, it was decided that Colonel Cogswell was, and once he was put in charge, he ordered a retreat. The 15th was told to slide over in front of the 20th to cover the retreat. The rest of the army retreated. Panic seized the Union troops. The retreat became a mad race down the bluff. At 6 p.m., Oliver Wendell Holmes was taken to a barn that served as the main hospital on Harrison's Island. He saw, quote, men lying around on the floor, a red blanket with an arm lying on it and a pool of blood, and near the entrance a surgeon calmly grabbing a man's finger and cutting it off. Nathan Hayward, the surgeon of the 20th, came to examine Holmes. "How does it look, doctor?" Holmes asked. "Shall I recover? Tell me the truth, for I really want to know." "Well, you may recover," Hayward told him. "That means the chances are against me, don't it?" Holmes asked. "Yes, the chances are against you," said Hayward, and he moved on. At 6:15 p.m., back on Ball's Bluff, the 15th managed to buy 20 minutes. "It was impossible to continue to resist," Colonel Devins wrote. He ordered a retreat, but now we went down the hill pell-mell, wrote Private Bowen of the 15th. Private Luther Hapgood also raced down the bluff. On the beach, he looked for his brother Joseph, but could not find him. He frantically asked a comrade if he had seen his brother. The man told Luther that he had seen Joseph fall in the clearing at the top of the bluff. So Luther turned and began crawling back up the cliff. Meanwhile, only 3 boats were available for the retreat. One became so overloaded with non-wounded men that it sank. The second boat, also overloaded, drifted away down the river. Confederate troops came to the edge of the bluff and began firing down at the troops on the beach. Again, this picture. Roland Bowen describes the scene. Oh, such terrible confusion, men running to and fro, others leaping into the river, the horrid forms of the dead, the last struggles of the dying, the groans of the wounded, and the heart-rending cries that would go up from 100 drowning lips. Heaven forbid that I may ever again witness such a scene as this. Willie Grout had returned with a large flatboat and had supervised its being loaded with wounded, but he did not go back with it. He watched as the oarsmen on the boat were all shot and fell, causing the boat to dip and fill with water, quickly sinking with its wounded cargo. Within half an hour after the retreat had begun, not a single boat was available to the Union troops. In the words of General Stone, nothing was left to our soldiers but to swim, surrender, or die. Grout saw Colonel Devins on the beach and went to him. Is there anything more I can do? He asked. Nothing but take care of yourself, Devins replied. So Grout joined the hundreds of others who were trying to swim the 150 yards to Harrison's Island. The Confederates kept up a murderous fire. Bullets fell so fast that the surface of the river looked to Captain William Bartlett of the 20th like a pond when it rains. Grout got about halfway across when he was struck in the head by a bullet. Tell Company D I should have escaped, but I am shot, he cried. Then he disappeared below the surface. Luther Hapgood scrambled up the side of the bluff. At the brow of the cliff, he found a rebel musket in his face. He was made a prisoner and was quickly led across the field where the battle had raged over the lifeless remains of Blue and Gray. Darkness brought an end to the fighting. The Union soldiers who remained on the beach were captured. The Battle of Ball's Bluff was over. 400,000 Confederates were engaged, 1,700 Union troops. 700 Union troops were captured, 400 were killed or wounded, and 600 managed to escape unharmed. The day after the battle, President Lincoln was at the telegraph office in the War Department. He went there often for the latest war news. While reading the latest dispatches, he came across one regarding the crushing defeat at Ball's Bluff and the death of his friend Edward Baker. A witness said Lincoln walked, quote, with bowed head and tears rolling down his furrowed cheeks, his face pale and wan, his heart heaving with emotion. The entire Lincoln family mourned the loss of Baker. On Thursday, October 24th, 1861, in Richmond, Virginia, a huge crowd had gathered in the Confederate capital to get a glimpse of the hated Union prisoners from Ball's Bluff, who arrived by train from Manassas Junction. Among the Union troops were Private Luther Hapgood of the 15th, Paul Revere and Colonel William Lee of the 20th Massachusetts, and Colonel Milton Cogswell of the 42nd New York. Why don't you send them down the river and make breastworks of them, shouted one woman. Send 50 of them to my plantation and I will teach them how to pick cotton, a man cried out. They were taken to Libby Prison, an old tobacco warehouse. The troops were greeted by Sergeant Henry Wurtz, or sometimes pronounced Wurtz, who would later be the commandant at Andersonville Prison. He was the only man executed for war crimes at the end of the war. Officers were put on the first floor of Libby Prison, the enlisted men on the top 2 floors. Luther Hapgood was on the 3rd floor. On Tuesday, November 12, 1861, in Worcester, Massachusetts, Willie Grout was laid to rest. His body was found near what is today the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. His was one of several bodies that floated down the river and washed up in Washington. His bloated body was identified because Grout had written his name on his clothing. His family, who had money, had the remains shipped home in a metallic coffin where a lavish funeral was held. Thursday, November 21st, 1861, was Thanksgiving in Massachusetts. Before Lincoln made it a national holiday, the governor of each state decided when Thanksgiving would be. So it was on Thursday, November 21st this year. Jonathan Grout, his wife Mary, and their daughters Ellen and Lizzie set a place at their table for their son and brother Willie. Family friend Henry Washburn stopped by to visit on what he was sure would be a difficult day. He was so moved by the empty seat at the table that he wrote the poem, The Vacant Chair. It was later put to music by George F. Root, who was a well-known writer of hymns. The song became popular on both sides during the war. My mother said that as a little girl in Massachusetts, they had to memorize the words to this, and she was proud that he was her ancestor. Just a snippet of the lyrics. At our fireside, sad and lonely, often will the bosom swell at remembrance of the story how our noble Willie fell. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. In November of 1861, Luther Hapgood was in Libby prison. The food that he and the other prisoners were served often contained maggots. Luther later related that they were sometimes fed, quote, rat soup thickened with rice, unquote. Women from Richmond sometimes brought prisoners food or blankets. One woman with a little girl gave Luther a blanket and said she hoped that if her husband was captured, some lady in the North might treat him kindly. Her young daughter stared in fascination at Luther. Her mother said, "Stop, it's impolite." "These Yankees look just like my daddy," the girl explained. "I thought all the Yankees had horns." On Monday, December 9th, 1861, Congress created the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Disgruntled by the defeat at Bluff, the committee looked to find out who was to blame. Bruce Catton called this a fearsome committee if there ever was one. They decided that Baker couldn't be responsible. He was a dead hero and the president's friend. It would not be Mcclellan, though he was criticized for his vague order on October 20th. Roscoe Conkling, Republican congressman from New York, addressed the House of Representatives. "Let the Army and the government know that the people and the representatives are in earnest. Let mismanagement and drowsiness tremble and wake up. Ball's Bluff cries aloud for scrutiny." But before an investigation had even begun, the Republican committee had already chosen their sacrificial lamb. It was Colonel Charles Pomeroy Stone, a Democrat. On Sunday, February 9th, 1862, Stone was arrested in the middle of the night. No charges were brought against him, and they never would be. He tried to get a hearing, but was ignored. President Lincoln said, "I could never believe General Stone would be disloyal." But he did not lift a finger to help him. He was intimidated by this committee. On Saturday, February 22nd, 1862, Luther Hapgood, who weighed less than 100 pounds, was exchanged. Also exchanged this day were Major Paul Revere and Colonels William Lee and Milton Cogswell. On Saturday, August 16th, 1862, General Stone was released after 189 days in solitary confinement. He received no apology, not even an acknowledgement of error. He was simply released. He would hold no important command for the duration of the war. Years after the war, he was the chief engineer for the construction of the Statue of Liberty's pedestal in 1883. He died shortly after the dedication at age 62. Major Paul Revere, shown here, of the 20th Mass, returned to action and was wounded on July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg. He was part of Dan Sickles' corps, and those of you who know anything of Gettysburg know that Sickles advanced his men on the second day off of Cemetery Ridge down to the Kadori farm off the high ground. So that's where Revere was wounded. He died 2 days later on the 4th of July. Joseph Hapgood recovered from his wound and returned to the 15th Massachusetts. He was wounded the same day as Revere and in the same location. He was sent home. His war was over, and here's a picture of him as an old man. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. He died in 1922 at age 82. Lieutenant Oliver Wendell Holmes would return, would return to action and would get wounded at Antietam, but he survived the war. In 1902, he was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Theodore Roosevelt. He served for 3 decades. He died in D.C. in 1932, 2 days shy of his 95th birthday. Luther Hapgood, and this is a picture of him as an old man in his GAR uniform, he was assigned to the Veterans Corps and saw no more action. During World War I, he stated, "When I fought in the Great Rebellion, we fought with our fists and bayonets, and you had to look in the eyes of the man you were going to kill." He was also often heard to say, "I'm a damn Yankee and damn proud of it." He died in 1923 at age 87. Again, if you go to the battlefield today, in the clearing where the battle was mainly fought, there is a small cemetery that contains a handful of men from both sides. It is the smallest national cemetery in the country. And I'll end my talk by pointing out the grave of Lieutenant John William Grout. It says killed at Ball's Bluff. His grave is in the same cemetery with my grandparents and my mother's parents. And it is through my mother's side that we are related to all 3 of these individuals. That concludes my talk. I'm sorry if I ran long.